Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. My name is Josho Brouwers and I'm joined by Joshua Hall and Matthew Lloyd. Today we're going to talk about Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. So maybe to begin with, maybe we should talk a little bit about the poem and its writer, because that's to start to say that this is an epic poem, a Latin epic poem, consciously modeled after the Homeric epics, but very different in that this is truly a literary work. It's not to say that the Iliad and Odyssey aren't literature, but the idea is that they're created based on oral traditions and stories, and that someone who the ancient Greeks called Homer ultimately forged into this poem, and then there was some editing going on in Athens, etc. But the Aeneid really is an epic poem that was consciously created by a single person, Virgil, of course based on other stories going on. Maybe we should talk a little bit about that.
Well, shall we go into some detail about the structure of the Aeneid? I mean, to sum it up very quickly, you have 12 books, the first 6 of which are modelled after the Odyssey, the second 6 of which are modelled after the Iliad. So, flipping the chronological order of the poems, obviously the order of their composition is more controversial, although the Iliad is usually put first. Then we open with in media res, with Aeneas arriving in Carthage and meeting Dido. Dido asks him to tell the story of his journey. Book 2 is the wooden horse, the fall of Troy, his escape. Book 3, his wanderings. Book 4, Dido and Aeneas' love affair. Book 5, some funeral games for Anchises a year later. Book 6 is the journey to the Underworld. Then books 7 through 12, the conflict in Latium. Aeneas arrives, is offered Lavinia's hand in marriage. That causes conflict with Turnus and the Latins. In Book 8, he has to go and seek help from the Greek king Evander, and that's when Pallas shows up. Book 9 is the Latins' attack on the Trojan ships, but also the story of Nisus Euryalus. Book 10, Aeneas returns, Pallas is killed. Book 11, further fighting. Book 12, the single combat between Aeneas and Turnus, which brings the war to an end.
The fact that it's flipped around, like say the first 6 books are Aeneas' wanderings, and the last 6 books are basically the battle epic, that sort of makes the whole thing more or less circular. And there's a lot of that sort of stuff that goes on in the Aeneid, where Virgil consciously takes something from an earlier source and flips it around or changes it. For example, when he outlines that one of Aeneas' descendants, the great Emperor Augustus, is going to found a new golden age, he basically again does this sort of circular thing, because according to Hesiod's Works and Days, the ages of men were divided into 4 or 5 main periods from the Golden Age, with Saturn ruling humanity and everybody being prosperous and healthy, etc. And then it sort of degenerates. It goes to the Silver Age, goes to the Bronze Age, goes to the Age of Heroes, where you have the Theban cycle, the Trojan War, and then it goes into an Iron Age, which is Hesiod's own time, and he says, this is an age where people no longer care about each other, where people will just get worse and worse until finally we just all go extinct. And Virgil flips this around by saying that, in time there's going to be another golden age brought about thanks to Aeneas settling in Latium. So he flips that around. The same way also when Aeneas goes into the Underworld, that scene is modeled after Odysseus going into the Underworld in the Odyssey. But whereas, when Odysseus goes into the Underworld, he meets the ghosts of the past. But when Aeneas goes into the Underworld, he meets the spirit of his father, who guides him and shows the unborn heroes of future Rome, the shades that will reincarnate, as it were, into the future heroes of Rome, including Augustus Caesar. So again, he flips this around, so he makes everything circular and takes what already existed and changes it to suit his own purposes. And that's also what makes it very literary in all the allusions that it has. The Homeric epics work within their particular context, and they build on stories that were in existence, oral traditions and what have you. But the Aeneid is very much a literary work in that there are loads of allusions also to Virgil's earlier poems, to other stories that were going on, to the Homeric epics, to Hesiod, to loads of other stuff. And that's what makes it a literary work, and also something that is worth reading, I think.
When discussing this the way it follows the Homeric epics, it's also worth bearing in mind that we talk about like flipping the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also within the first 6 books, that's not a linear following of Odysseus' journey. This is also mixed up. Like, the journey to the Underworld is not told in retrospect by the hero. It is something that happens later on in sort of the middle of the poem. And yeah, it's not copying the outline straightforwardly. It's mixing it up and shuffling it in a way to make something that is very different. I mean, it's not a copy. It's clearly using these things as inspiration and playing off that.
I do love the all of Book 6 and the journey to the Underworld, and just the way that Virgil portrays all of the coming Roman heroes. That's great. It's a great work of propaganda history, or propagandistic history.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people say, but is it propaganda when you consider that a lot of the audience of the Aeneid would have been, or the audience in general of the Aeneid would have been fairly small? I mean, it would have been just the educated elite in Rome who could read for the most part. They would have listened or read this, so it would have been a work of propaganda in that case. I mean, I know that that's often said, especially by critics of the Aeneid, where they say, well, this isn't really literature. This is just something that Virgil wrote in order to get into Augustus's good books. But I don't know, is that perfectly valid?
I don't know. I don't really like the idea of it being Augustan propaganda, but in some ways I do think that it reads and feels like cultural propaganda, and I'm sure Virgil didn't write it necessarily to be so. But if you were to hand this to a Greek at the time, in the 1st century BC, who has just witnessed Rome essentially conquer the known world, it could function as cultural propaganda of, well, this is why we've been able to do this. This is, our glorious founding. I mean, even if you cut out all references to Augustus, I think it still could function in some ways as propaganda. But being written in Latin at that time, it clearly wasn't meant for that purpose.
Yeah, no, definitely. But I think, the idea is that because a lot of the Aeneid, but it comes back a few times. In book 1, Jupiter tells Venus that that Aeneas is destined for greatness, basically, and that his descendants are destined for greatness. And it comes back later when he goes into the Underworld, and Anchises shows the shades of future Roman heroes, and again on the shield of Aeneas, which, if we're talking about Homeric echoes, the Aeneas, like Achilles, gets a new shield, a new armor, but especially a new shield forged by Vulcan, so the Roman equivalent of Hephaestus, in the same way that Achilles in the Iliad also gets a new armor and a new shield in the Iliad after Hector kills Patroclus and takes the equipment. And on that shield are also the scene of Romulus and Remus being raised by the she-wolf, and it ends with Augustus. So you could say, that this is all propagandistic, meant to help elevate Augustus's position, and to some extent that might have been a reason, because even in the earlier poem, I mean, Virgil wrote 2 more poems, the Eclogues and the Georgics, and that last one, there's actually a tradition that Virgil and his patron Maecenas took turns reading that to then Octavian when he returned victorious from the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which is basically the end of the Roman Republic as we knew it. So already then he was in this circle with Augustus, but there is a certain sincerity, I think, to how Virgil writes about this glorious future of Aeneas' descendants, that I think, to call it propaganda would essentially be calling Virgil a sellout, which I don't think is really the case. Because I
don't know that you have to call him a sellout, though. I mean, that's the same approach that people who supposedly listen to real punk. That's the same thing that they say about every band that sells more than 5 records at the local corner shop. I'm not sure that you necessarily have to go all the way in describing him as a sellout if that was part of the reason that he wrote the Aeneid. I mean, flattering your friends is a fun exercise, even if you take it pretty far in
he takes it incredibly far, of course. I mean, he basically he takes it as far as you could. I mean, it's basically a national epic about one of. I mean, this should be pointed out, of course, that according to Roman tradition, Aeneas is an ancestor of not just Romans in general, but of Augustus in particular. Augustus, as Octavian, was adopted posthumously by Julius Caesar, who, as his name said, is a member of the Julii. And the Julii got their name from Julius, which is the alternate name for Ascanius, Aeneas' son. And Aeneas, of course, is the son of the goddess of love, Aphrodite, Venus. So the whole poem is basically about not just the history of or the future history of Rome, or what Rome is going to be, and the founding father of the Roman people, but also in a very real sense sort of a pseudo-biography of one of Augustus's ancestors. And in a lot of ways, in the same way that the Aeneid mirrors the Homeric epics, the story of Aeneas also sort of mirrors the career and life of Augustus, in that he is destined to bring his people into an age of prosperity and that sort of stuff. In the same way that Augustus is credited with having finally brought peace, because we haven't really touched about the historical and cultural context yet. But
and Augustus, of course, himself the son of a god, in being adopted by Julius Caesar, who was a god, of course, as we all know.
Yeah.
Well, how else would he have accomplished everything that he did?
Exactly. Oh, but after his death, of course, he was. Yeah, but that's the precedent that Augustus that is set with the Roman emperors, in that after they die, mostly they get elevated to godhood, and the same thing happened to Julius Caesar. So that's By
the time Virgil's writing this, Rome has gone through multiple civil wars, and the social fabric hadn't necessarily been torn asunder, but it was kind of falling apart. You have Romans killing Romans for almost 100 years straight, until, as you mentioned earlier, the Battle of Actium, and Augustus essentially reuniting Roman people, if you will, around him, around his personality. And in a lot of ways, again, why some people describe the Aeneid as Augustan propaganda is because this poem kind of is a cultural artifact of that reunification of the Roman people back into one identity. Ideally, you no longer have the populares and the optimates fighting against each other, trying to vie for power. You just have Augustus in his saintly seat, looking down upon everybody else and helping to guide the Romans. But you also have Rome in this last century essentially extending their reach all the way to the eastern Mediterranean. Obviously, they'd wiped out essentially all of their enemies in the west by this point. By 146, Carthage was a burning ruin. But in the 1st century BC, you have Caesar taking Egypt, which was kind of the last standing of the great Hellenistic states. You have Ptolemaic Egypt falling to the Romans. And to me, that's really the context of the Aeneid. It's not necessarily Augustus, but it's Rome finally making the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum, our sea. And that's why I think it's so interesting that Virgil decided on a Trojan-themed epic, because everywhere in this poem is now Roman territory, which is very interesting.
Well, you're talking about the Punic Wars happen in the middle of the 2nd century, and yet they are sort of the context for the first 4 books. This is the origin of that bit of Roman history. I mean,
it's an interesting shade that's still hanging over Rome by this period. The Punic Wars. I mean, it's really the Hannibalic War that is looming. It's still at the end of the 3rd century BC. that's still looming so very large.
Well, Virgil does something very interesting, of course, in the opening books of the Aeneid, where Aeneas and his followers, the survivors of Troy, basically arrive in Carthage and spend some time there. In that, first of all, it explains the origin of the hostilities between the Romans and the Carthaginians, because when Queen Dido, before she kills herself, she curses Aeneas and his descendants that they will forever be at war with each other. So that's, the Roman and the Punic Wars. And the second thing, of course, is that Dido has been compared to Cleopatra, who played an instrumental role, of course, at the Battle of Actium, in that she tries to keep Aeneas in Carthage, to basically keep him from fulfilling his destiny, in the same way that Cleopatra, of course, first managed to seduce the Roman general Caesar, and then later the Roman general Mark Antony. So there are parallels there where Virgil both tries to explain something that happened in the not so distant past with the Roman Punic Wars, and also tries to sort of create this analogy between Dido on the one hand and Cleopatra on the other, trying to keep the Roman, Trojan general leader from fulfilling their destiny. And in the case of Aeneas, of course, they're not successful, because Aeneas is, as Virgil repeats again and again, very pious.
And Mercury tells him to.
Yeah. Well, Jupiter says Mercury to basically remind him of what he had to do. So then he goes like, oh yeah, damn, I have to go and look for this new homeland, which, yeah.
With Book 4, you've got the historical context that is building into it, but also this is the best relationship in this poem. So Aeneas you have Creusa, his wife, mother of Ascanius, who is just there to be the mother of Ascanius and gets unceremoniously killed off in Book 2. That was 7 years ago, so he's over it. You do have Anchises, who, that is an important relationship, and that is perhaps the one we see the most passion on Aeneas' side, where he's devastated by his father's death. He has these funeral games, he has the encounter with him in the underworld. But then you have Lavinia, who doesn't even speak, and Pallas, whose role as the Patroclus of this story has always seemed one of the weaker elements. We're supposed to imagine this strong tie between Aeneas and Pallas after Evander sends his son with this Trojan to help him, and then he also pretty much gets unceremoniously killed as soon as he shows up on the battlefield. And then it's seeing his Turnus wearing his armor that ultimately leads Aeneas to kill Pallas, but it's always like, well, who is Pallas? What's he done? Whereas in Book 4, you've got this sort of passionate story between these two older people that has been become operas, and really is the standout relationship in this story. And we get it almost entirely from Dido's perspective. Like, we don't really see what Aeneas is feeling, and that's true of most of these. Anchises is the sort of exception there, where we see Anchises, like Aeneas' strong feelings for his father, but his relationship with Dido, it is just Dido is manipulated by Venus into falling in love with him and tries to keep him, and that's all on her. Aeneas, as soon as Aeneas is told, oh yeah, you have to go and found Rome, he's like, oh yeah, I'm off. And as a work of literature, I think that makes us turn against Aeneas. I don't think that's what Virgil meant to do. I don't know that that's what Roman audiences would have done, but as a 21st century person, I read this and think Aeneas is terrible.
I was just going to say, I think we've now officially described every major character from the three great ancient epics as being awful people. by at least 21st century standards.
Well,
I think Aeneas isn't so much awful as he seems. He's suffering a bit from the Jason syndrome, in that he seems very passive for the most part. The gods tell him to do something, and he goes and does it because he's pious. So
his character is very hollow.
Yeah, if Jupiter says jump, Aeneas says how high. That's basically the thing. It's only in the second half when they're fighting that he becomes more and more enraged, as it were. Like Achilles, the rage takes hold of him, and he becomes a more interesting character, I think. And the poem ends with him basically wounding his big enemy Turnus, who was originally destined to be married to Lavinia. But because there was a prophecy that she had to be married off to a foreigner as soon as Aeneas appears, it's like, oh, please have my daughter's hand in marriage. And Turnus gets angry, so there's this fight, and in the final book it reaches this sort of high point, this climax, where Aeneas finally manages to drive his spear through Turnus' thigh, and Turnus basically raises his hand and surrenders. Virgil specifically said that Aeneas is tempted to sort of let him live and let him return to his people when he sees this baldric or belt that belonged to Pallas on Turnus' shoulder, and he, in just rage, takes hold of him, and he drives his sword through Turnus' chest, through his heart. And then Turnus' spirit is said to go to the underworld with a groan. And that's the only character development that Aeneas gets, basically, is that he becomes more and more angry in that second half, whereas before he was very passive and basically did what the gods wanted him to do. So that's sort of the only moment that makes him not completely like Jason, because Jason is weak all through the story of the Argonauts, and here at least you can see that he becomes more like Achilles towards the final bit of the Aeneid, for better or for worse. I mean, there are people that say the way that the poem ends in such a dramatic fashion, with Aeneas basically killing somebody who surrendered to him, makes him inherently unsympathetic, and sort of makes them question whether Virgil had grown disillusioned with the subject matter, whether he had grown disillusioned with Augustus, or with where the Roman Empire was, or whatever. I think that's looking too much into the subject. It's just that the rage builds all through those last 6 books until it finally culminates into Aeneas basically performing an impious act, basically by slaying Turnus in this.
So you don't think that it's expressive of Virgil's view of Roman history, that the Romans were quiet, passive, and pious for about half of their history, and then all of a sudden were overtaken by furor and conquered the known world, killing the last elements of the East with a sword to the chest?
Yeah. There are loads of different interpretations of the Aeneid, of course, and the tension between furor on the one side, so the rage, the violence, and pietas on the other side, the piety, the piousness. That's the main theme of the book, basically, and it sort of plays, of course, on the rage of the Iliad, which, rage is the first word when you read the Iliad in the original Greek. So that's and piety and dissing the gods, basically, is something that causes Odysseus to have to wander the seas for a decade. So again, these are all Homeric allusions, and it's the basic tension between this piety and this rage that forms the bulk of the Aeneid as far as themes are concerned. And the question is, of course, that which is something that I read in this book, this version of the Aeneid that I have with an introduction by Matthew Santirocco, where he basically says that the question arises whether the prosperity of the Roman Empire, or the prosperity of whatever, the peace that you try to seek, should not be achieved without losing sight of the human suffering that is caused along the way. So he sort of suggests that what Virgil tries to do in the Aeneid is he paints these grandiose pictures of establishing order over chaos, establishing peace and prosperity instead of war, but that establishing this peace comes at a cost. And the cost in this particular case is, at the very end of the Aeneid at least, Aeneas manages to secure a foothold in Latium, but he does this by basically performing the impious act by slaughtering Turnus after he surrendered to himself. So the question is, does the end justify the means, basically? That's what it comes down to in this particular sense. That's what he suggests in his introduction to this edition. I think that's a very good point to raise.
That is interesting. I wonder if there was any intentional allusion to maybe some of the deaths. I don't know why, but when you were saying that, the Pompey's end kind of popped into my head as a good parallel to that, because obviously, yes, Caesar did win the civil war, but Pompey was unceremoniously murdered on his way into Alexandria.
Yeah, by the Ptolemaic Greeks, who thought they were doing him a favor. Yeah, it's a strange thing, because why would the Romans assume that the Trojans were their ancestors? I mean, obviously they wanted a tie to the distant past of the Greeks, because the Greeks to them were, or at least the Greeks of the past to the Romans, were civilized and the high point of culture, and they adopted a lot of stuff from the Greeks, of course. So why? But at the same time, they had sort of this tense relationship with the Greeks, because the Greeks of the Roman era itself were thought to be, by and large, more decadent and not as high-minded and as cultured as the Greeks were of the classical period. So could this be that tension that they wanted to have a link to the ancient Greeks, but not actually say that we're derived from the Greeks? The reason that they picked a Trojan to be the ancestor, basically, of the Roman people in general, I have no idea. Imagine that figures into somewhere.
Good question.
Yeah.
I mean, because obviously, long before the Aeneid, you have references to Aeneas in Etruscan art, which is fairly odd as to how or why that would have come into being. I mean, there are a handful of people who do believe that there was some sort of immigration myth related to the Trojans that existed sometime in the late Iron Age.
Yeah, there are a few also from earlier sources, from classical and later, of Trojans going westward. I mean, Deiphobos, I think, so one of Hector's brothers, eventually settles in, I don't remember, he becomes king in Epirus or something, of a place, somewhere in the Balkans at least. And there are other stories of Diomedes pairing up with another Trojan, going on a colonization expedition to Italy. So there are all these stories already from at least the classical period onwards of, especially there's something in Ira Malkin's book on Odysseus and the Greek colonization about these Trojan-Greek pairings, where you would think, mortal enemies, but they sort of pair off hand in hand, and they go and they found all these colonies in Italy and Sicily and other places. So there's a whole substrate, a whole long tradition of these stories of Trojans going west, and already in the Iliad even Aeneas is marked out as special and as pious, and it's very strange because we have no idea what the Greeks particularly were thinking about this, because at one point Achilles nearly murders Aeneas, and then Poseidon, so Neptune in the Roman version, intervenes and says, no, don't touch him, because he's destined for greatness, because in the genealogy, Aeneas is related to Priam, but he's from a different branch of the family, and they all connect. They're all descended from Dardanos, who was supposedly one of Zeus's favorite sons. Sorry, Ares. Sorry, Apollo. So, and Zeus wanted the branch that Priam was a part of, which is probably derived from Laomedon, to go extinct, but he wanted the rest of the family to sort of be preserved. So that's why Aeneas was protected, and he was allowed to escape Troy and move wherever westward. In the Aeneid too, there are, because he was wandering the seas for 7 years before he arrived at Carthage, and he tried to found colonies in different places along the way, including Crete, and none of those really took. So he kept being pushed forward by the gods, because they said, no, you're not supposed to settle here, of course, move on. So Aeneas pious as he was, kept moving on. So, and the interesting thing is also, if you want to talk about the historical aspects, is that in the Aeneid, at one point when Aeneas goes back to Sicily, because he goes to Sicily and then he goes to Carthage and then he goes back to Sicily, sort of bouncing around the Mediterranean there. The Trojan women have had enough. The female survivors that have accompanied them have had enough, and they set fire to the ships. And Jupiter then sends a rainstorm, which preserves most of the fleet. But Aeneas then says, okay, you know what, whoever wants to stay here, the women and whoever of the other survivors want to stay here, you can stay here, found a colony, and the rest of us will move on. So this group of survivors that Aeneas has, because most of the summaries that you read online say a few survivors from Troy, but it's actually quite a sizable group of people if you piece everything together, with all the cities that he founds in his wake, basically, as he moves from Troy westward to Italy. So also on Sicily they leave this colony behind, and then it's just Aeneas and the hardiest of his men, basically, that go on and go to Latium. And they're just men, of course, so they have to get native women in order to be able to procreate and found a viable city. And that, of course, is also derived from historical sources, because we know in many instances that colonists who moved westward, we know most about the Greeks who did that, they tended to be all men. So they had a problem where they had to settle and had to marry local women. There's even a reference to that with Evander, the king of the Greeks, who has founded a city on the spot later occupied by Rome, also not coincidentally, of course, where he says that Pallas, his boy, his son, is half Sabine, because his mother was a Sabine, obviously. So that too is again this sort of thing, and we see that also in the archaeological record at various Greek cities. When you look at the earliest cemeteries, you see graves that have loads of native material in there, and the suggestion is that there were loads of, it wasn't just a Greek colony with all Greeks plopped down somewhere in Italy. It was always this intermixture of different peoples and ethnicities working together in order to create a viable, sustainable city. So it was always this interplay.
There are of course instances though that the archaeology shows the Greek town was built on top of earlier native to use.
Especially nice with a nice ash layer in between.
Yeah, so they weren't always peaceful.
No. Oh no, definitely
interethnic, cooperative.
Yeah.
I just
no, and I mean the rape of the Sabine women makes clear that if they didn't have women of their own, sometimes you didn't need diplomacy to get wives. You could just raid the nearest village, take all the women, and then Bob's your uncle. So.
Just going back to the second trip to Sicily, it's interesting because in Book 5 at line 630, in All's translation at least, it reads, "Here we have brotherly Eryx's land and a host in Kestes." And it's interesting that Virgil puts them near Mount Eryx in western Sicily, because the Elymians, the native population in that area, have a foundation myth tying them to Trojans as well. Supposedly the Elymians were descendants of Trojan evacuees. And I find it interesting that he doesn't actually mention the Elymians at all, or try to tie in the idea that, the Trojans that Aeneas left behind on Sicily were actually the Elymians, because of course in the First Punic War, the Elymians, for the most part, defected to the Romans from the Carthaginian side. So he missed a good opportunity for an historical tie-in. Perhaps he wasn't aware of it, but it's also interesting because in this, and placing them in the land of Eryx actually it kind of shows I don't want to say a struggle, but something like that with the Greeks, because from at least the end of the 6th century BC onwards, there were Greeks who claimed that land as their own and specifically sent colonization efforts to it because supposedly Heracles had won it for his people or for himself, and it was rightfully theirs. So you have that in the story of Doriaeus, the great Spartan failure. He was the brother of King Leonidas, Thermopylae fame, of course. But Doriaeus utterly failed when he tried to found a colony near Mount Eryx because he was wiped out or driven out by an alliance of Elymians and Carthaginians. And it is interesting that you have the Romans, or the Proto-Romans, in Aeneas's caravan in the land of Eryx, because, by this time it was rightfully Greek, but obviously the Greeks never got it. It is interesting, though, that this is essentially the story of the foundation of Rome, and they celebrate being an immigrant nation.
Oh,
which,
yeah, but I mean, that's obvious also when Aeneas arrives in Latium, of course. I mean, he forges an alliance with the Latins, basically, and then he's also told to go and forge an alliance with the Greeks, with Evander, and Evander then tells him, you should also forge an alliance with the Etruscans. So you have basically this whole core of Rome, or with these proto-Romans, like you say, already, where they forge alliances with people too. They're not afraid of strangers. I mean, they embrace everybody, basically, and to fight for this common cause of basically conquering Latium.
It's hearkening to Roman history as the Romans note themselves, and it may only be a modern phenomenon that we recognize the supposed open society of early Rome, but I mean, it's something that Livy emphasized, and it's something that you do see Virgil emphasizing as well. And as near contemporaries, I think that is very interesting, and especially just how readily Romans of the centuries around the turn of the millennium were very open to the idea that not only was their city a city of immigrants, but it was what we would describe in today as being a multi-ethnic society as well, and they were very happy.
Well, this kind of embracing foreigners, you also see that with the Greeks, basically, especially if you look at Eastern Greece, so the islands in Anatolia, where you have cities where you have completely bilingual populations, of course. So you got cities where people speak Greek and Lydian more or less fluently, or in both. Get the impression maybe Matt wanted to...
I was just going to throw in, we're calling Aeneas and his crew immigrants, but that's not quite the picture, again, through this modern lens, in that they haven't left their home to go somewhere else. They've been driven out of their home to go somewhere else. They're refugees rather than immigrants in modern language. We talked about this a little bit earlier when Josh was talking about how, with this Battle of Actium, with Egypt being brought into the Roman Empire, we have Roman control of the entire Mediterranean. And that is something that hasn't happened before in history. And it does give them this, it's not quite free movement, because it's still, sea travel is dangerous, you can't police the sea. I mean, even today, that's difficult. But you do have this ability to connect across the sea, this idea that moving around is something that is useful, not something that is terrifying. And that's, this is the point at which that becomes a lot more possible through that conquest.
Yeah, the Aeneid in many ways sort of is the beginning of history and also the end of history, because it starts, of course, with the Trojan War. If you read all the ancient historians, they always start with the Trojan War, sort of this earliest historic event, and then you got, of course, some stuff before that, and you have the theogony for the earlier mythical history with the gods and the creation of the universe and all that. But the Trojan War is like this solid anchor point of history, and the Aeneid starts with the end of the Trojan War, basically, and then moves towards the era of Augustus. This is constant foreshadowing of the era of Augustus. And the time of Augustus is sort of presented like this endpoint in history where, you have this golden age again and peace and prosperity, and it sort of ties everything together again in this sort of circular way where you have the beginning of history and the end of history in one epic poem, where Augustus is sort of presented as like the culmination of centuries of Roman advancement, let's say, and that sort of fits also in with what Matt was saying, that with the conquest of Egypt and turning it into a province, basically the Romans control the whole of the Mediterranean. They've gotten rid of all of their rivals. They got rid of Carthage in the 2nd century BC. They got rid of Egypt now. They already own Greece and Anatolia, so all of that is there. So it's basically the end point of history, and I'm just trying to imagine what it would have been like for Romans living at that particular period, like Virgil, who died in 19 BC, so well before Augustus died. What it would have been like for him to live in that particular era, whether he truly felt like it was also, like some dramatic point had been reached, like, it can't get any better, basically. That's sort of that.
Like the 90s.
That's the idea that you get from that. Like the 90s. Music.
I miss the 90s.
Terrible music and terrible clothes.
I mean that literally in the sense of, the end of history as a phrase is used for, the fall of the Soviet Union and the advance of liberal democracy, and we're now realizing that, it's now obvious to everyone that no, that didn't happen. Which I'm sure was similar at 25 years after Augustus, after Actium, but may not have been 10 years after Actium. When we try and put a chronology on early Greek history, when we look at the Trojan War and say it's 1184 or whatever year they say that the Trojan War is, and on June the 16th or whatever, there are several different dates. But when we try and put the Trojan War in history, it's worth noting that in the Aeneid, the Trojan War ends 7 years before the founding of Carthage, which we know is 9th century. So the idea that there is an ancient knowledge of these prehistorical events, that seems to me to undermine it a little, or at least it's an interesting contraction of prehistory that foundation of Carthage is put in this Trojan War period, this sort of beginning of history / end of the heroic age thing, rather than in what we would normally think of as several centuries later.
Yeah, but that's one of the problems with dating basically myth and legend is that also the ancient Greeks, they didn't have a particular time for the Trojan War. According to some, it took place in the 12th century BC, and others said around 1000 BC or even later or earlier. It's just that modern scholarship is latched on to, circa 1200 BC, because that sort of lines up well with the end of the Bronze Age and the destruction layers at Troy, at the archaeological site. But it's basically just all rubbish. And the Greeks and the Romans didn't care at all, because for them the distant past was a distant past, and it didn't matter if it was 18 generations ago or 10 generations ago. It was very long ago. That's all you needed to know. They weren't obsessed with chronology as we are, and that's also clear with the story of Aeneas himself. I mean, Virgil sort of pushes the founding of, creates this large gap between Aeneas settling in Latium and the founding of Rome. But in other stories that were also circulating back in the day, Aeneas actually founds Rome directly. He becomes the founder of Rome, or it's founded by Ascanius, or it's very flexible how much time there is between the two. And in the ancient world, you can have all of these contradictions because there was no sense of a canon at all. Like nowadays, we all have this obsession, like there has to be absolute dates and it has to happen at an absolute time and it has to be a particular, only one thing can be true. But for the ancients, multiple things could be true. It sort of depended on the context, and there are all these different local stories, etc.
That we have like this very historically informed poem. Like something I was thinking when we were talking about Dido is that yes, there's this ongoing history connected here. Like Dido is reflective of Cleopatra, which is the very recent history, but also of Hannibal and the Punic Wars, which is a couple of century before. And like it is this knowledge of an ongoing history, and yet its historical setting is more fluid than that. So it is it does give us an idea of how they're thinking about the distant past as opposed to the recent past in this very historically aware work of propaganda, poem, national epic.
No. Yeah. Maybe it is good to sort of point out that unlike the Homeric epics and the stories of the Trojan War, which Greeks put in this distant past, basically in this age, in this heroic age, or as Ovid would later just the Bronze Age, not to be confused with the archaeological Bronze Age. So the remote past, at least. Virgil tries to sort of connect. Again, you have this sort of like this creating of bridges that he tries to do, where he connects this mythical past to the historical reality, to the present even. So he tries to connect the two in a way that the Greeks never really did with any of their stories. I mean, you had Heracles going around founding cities and fathering loads and loads of peoples along the way in his travels, and that was sort of a tenuous link to the mythical past. But Virgil is the first who really tries to sort of create this very concrete link between the age of the heroes and the modern Roman Empire, let's say.
I have a thought that goes back to sort of the propaganda question. We use propaganda, which is a loaded word, again, in the 21st century. But an alternative way of thinking about this is that Virgil's political position has influenced his writing, which it does for everyone at a certain level of awareness. And Virgil seems very aware of what he's doing, but this is something he is positive about. So we talked about him flipping Hesiod's story of the declining ages. Well, does that partially seem because Virgil is optimistic about this future? He is looking at what is happening and thinking, well, I've had a terrible history in my lifetime has been terrible, but now this actually looks promising. This looks like something good is actually happening. Rather than thinking of it as this politically motivated poem written with Augustan money behind it to tell everyone about how great Augustus is and how he's descended from Venus and the founders of Rome and is thus destined to rule. It's, well, I actually feel this quite strongly myself.
Yeah, that's why I said that I think there is a certain sincerity in what he describes. That it seems almost that he must have believed it. Like I said, there are some people who think that the ending sort of shows that he was growing disillusioned with the Roman Empire and in how abruptly it sort of ends, even though if you read the entire poem in one go, the ending, it's a good point to end the story because we already know what's going to happen next because Virgil's been telling us a few times already. So, but yeah, the way that he kills Turnus is sort of interpreted by some people as indicating that Virgil maybe was having doubts about whether or not the future was going to be as great or as peaceful as he hoped it would be. But yeah.
And of course, part of that comes from the fact that we have our own doubts both about Augustus's sincerity in this bringing peace, and because we know what happened next, and that the Roman Empire, well, did terrible things, had done, continued to.
Well, you could say that the poem basically is about anxiety for the future. And that the whole poem is about trying to sort of diffuse that anxiety by, in the case of Aeneas at least, continuously showing him what the future is going to be like. Whenever he has doubts, his father shows him, no, don't have any doubts, because this is what the future is going to look like. And that's sort of what we would all like, of course. We would all like, whenever we have doubts, like, am I doing the right thing? What's going to be like? What's tomorrow going to bring? We would love there to be, the shade of an ancestor to pop up and say, don't worry, everything is going to turn out like this. And then, it's this anxiety about the future. You sort of wonder if maybe Virgil at one point was like, wait a moment, the future actually isn't as secure or as sure as it is in the case of Aeneas. We don't know what's going to happen, and that's an interesting thing, I think, that the poem also brings to the table, this anxiety about the future.
I like the idea of Augustus being visited in some sort of drunken stupor by the ghost of Julius Caesar, patting him on the shoulder, reassuring him, "Yes, everything's going to be fine, son. Don't worry."
Just don't turn those senators. Don't turn your back to those senators. You never know.
What was I going to say? It's worth bearing in mind, though, that Aeneas gets this reassurance in the Underworld, and several times the gods tell him everything's going to be all right. But when he leaves the Underworld, he goes through the door of forgetfulness, or I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
And forgets everything he's seen in the Underworld. And when he gets his shield with like this glorious image of Actium on the middle, he looks at it and smiles, but has no idea what it is. Like, he doesn't recognize any of these figures. So he doesn't quite get the reassurance. Or maybe we all get that reassurance and we forget it as well.
No, that's true. I mean, that's one of the aspects of Aeneas, is that he is a little bit dumbfounded by stuff that he sees, and also when the gods tell him to do something, he never questions why. He just does it, and he sort of shrugs and goes like, "Well, I guess the gods know what they're doing." That's one of the reasons why he sometimes comes across as a bit weak and Jason-esque in his portrayal. Yeah, true.
I wonder if perhaps, again, going back to the idea that the fury at the end of the book is is Virgil having doubts about this new world that's been created. I wonder if Aeneas's either feigned or real ignorance throughout is perhaps another indication of his kind of faltering faith in Augustus. If you want to try to think that Aeneas was the Augustus or Augustus was the modern.
You've got to believe that if there is this underlying anti-Augustan sentiment in the Aeneid, if Virgil's faith is waning, that Augustus didn't notice it. Especially with, the myth that Virgil asked for it to be destroyed on his deathbed, whether or not we believe that actually happened, and even if we do believe it actually happened, whether or not he would have expected that to happen because he'd have been dead and we wouldn't have known. Augustus then makes the decision not to destroy it, or Augustus has the power, we can assume, to stop this from going out if he suspects it of undermining him, and he doesn't. And I think it's fair to say that Augustus wasn't an idiot. So I think our reading of underlying anti-Augustan ideas is not something that would have been obvious in first century Rome, which makes me doubt that it exists at all. And it's more our perspective being, hopefully, more critical of the Roman Empire, knowing its future history, that we see that there. That's us reading it into the poem because of our own expectations and approaches. And I think the Aeneid stands up very well to modern reading in terms of the story of Dido and Aeneas and much of the story as a whole.
It's also a lot shorter than the Iliad or the Odyssey, so it's easier to read.
Yeah.
So quicker to read.
Yeah.
So, but it's something that really it stands on the shoulders of. That's maybe something. I mean, it's very respectful towards its source material, and Virgil clearly tried to incorporate a lot of the folklore and a lot of the earlier literature that he had read and was familiar with. He was obviously highly educated, and in that sense, it sort of, you get the impression from reading this that this was also meant to be Virgil's final word on epic poetry, basically. It's sort of like you could imagine Virgil going around saying, well, everybody else can stop writing epic poems now because this is it. This is the high point. In the same way that he presents his story as from the beginning of history to the end of history. So yeah, it's definitely very, very readable still for a modern audience. There's a lot that you can get out of this.
Talking about the Virgil's creation of this, we probably should point out for readers who don't know this that The Aeneid is not the first Roman epic. It's not the first Latin epic. It's the earliest that survives in its entirety, obviously.
And it survives in very early manuscripts also, which is noteworthy. I mean, there's a 5th century manuscript of the Aeneid, so it's a very early source also.
And obviously, it's not the first to deal with the foundation of Rome. I mean, Aeneas's poem, if I remember correctly, starts with the story, a story of the foundation of Rome. I can't remember what it is because it's been too long.
Something that when I was studying the Aeneid, I found tricky in discussions about this is the similarity of sound between Ennius and Aeneas. So that's Ennius, the poet, not Aeneas, the mythical founder of Rome / Proto-Rome. Oh, a little about the afterlife of the Aeneid. I mean, we know it becomes this national epic, and it's very popular throughout history. I'm just thinking, like, its story of the fall of Troy, its version of the Trojan horse is one that really sticks. Virgil's version of the Underworld is influential on Dante, obviously. Dido and Aeneas I've already mentioned as an opera. The only thing I can think of for the second half is Ursula Le Guin's Lavinia, which I've also written about on the website.
Oh, thinking back to the days of studying Latin, I loved the Aeneid. However, one of the other Roman epics, Lucan's Great Pharsalia, had to be my least favorite text that I ever translated. I love the story, but I hate the Latin.
I liked the Georgics, especially Book 4 of the Georgics. I think it's better than the Aeneid, but just that one book. The other 3 books are just about farming, but Book 4 is great.
I like the Georgics for their rusticity or rusticness. Very nice, much more friendly tale than the Aeneid.
And this is a good point to wrap up the episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to learn more about the ancient world, visit our website at www.ancientworldmagazine.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.